Thanks, Aaron. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you, Aaron. Um, it's really exciting to be talking about this. Something I never thought I'd say a long time ago, and it's cool to see the folks in the chat, many who dear friends and have taught me probably more about this topic than I'll ever know. So I'm just blessed to have been able to learn from some people about this stuff and then got fired up and excited about it. And so, first and foremost, I'm a person in long-term recovery. For me, that means I haven't used alcohol or the drugs since 2001. And about 6 years into my recovery, I met some people who taught me how to introduce myself that way. And those same people taught me the why we introduced ourselves that way, and then also taught me about that we weren't the first people to stand up and tell our stories in recovery. And there was a long history of people who did this, which in my early recovery, I didn't think was possible. And I didn't think that people did that. And I'll probably belabor most of our slides are just pictures. And so we'll put some pictures up and talk and tell stories. And so it'll be a nice kind of uh, night between me and Jeremiah, just talking about these two events. But when I first got into recovery, um, it was in I had grown up in a town in Connecticut that bordered Easton, Connecticut, and Easton is a small little Easton Reading line. It's a small little rural area in Fairfield County, Connecticut, and there's a little road called 58, and it's a state road, and they had a 12-step meeting every, I think it was Friday nights, and it was a well-attended 12-step meeting. Um, and I had been taught quite a bit about um, two men who co-founded a 12-step program, who many of you probably are very familiar with. And I learned a lot of history early in my recovery about 1935 and then 1939 and this very well-tread history of the 12-step movement. Um, but I reflect, I went to this meeting and they had this picture of this woman at the front of the meeting. And I didn't know who she was. Nobody ever, I went to the meeting for a couple of years. Nobody ever told me who she was. There was just this picture of this woman and no one ever talked about her. And it wasn't until 2011, I think, when I had the opportunity to sit down and interview William White, William Moyers, Stacia Murphy, Tom Hill, Tom Coder, Aaron Kacharsky, um, and and many others. And this woman's name started to come up, and her name is Marty Mann. And I didn't know much about Marty Mann at that point. I had set out to make a documentary about the recovery movement that started in 2001 and went forward. I wasn't really set out to make a movie about history before 2001. It was, we got together in St. Paul, Minnesota in 2001 and started a campaign called Faces and Voice of Recovery. And that was the movie that I set out to make in 2010 and 2011 that became The Anonymous People. But all of a sudden, through those interviews, Marty Mann and her story started to come up more and more and more, and grounded in the people who had come together in 2001. Their motivation was grounded in the history of who had come before them, and people like Harold Hughes and some people I'll talk about tonight. And so it created a sense of so I read Marty's biography. If those of you who are interested should definitely read Marty's biography. She was the first woman to achieve long-term recovery in Alcoholics Anonymous, and her biography is spectacular. What she did for our movement and for recovery advocacy is really awe-inspiring. She stumbled into Clinton Street in Brooklyn in the fall of 39. So about 6 months or 5 months after the big book, I'm sorry, April of 39, she stumbled into Clinton Street, like on the heels of when the book was being published. And the story goes that they ushered her into the kitchen with Lois Wilson. Um, and Lois promptly walks her back to the group of men and says, "No, no, no, Marty's an alcoholic, and she needs to sit with you all." And there was a big debate on whether or not Marty should be able to sit with the men of this new movement of Alcoholics Anonymous. And so Marty hung with them, and she had her ups and downs in these early years, but she became kind of the first woman to ever achieve long-term recovery. She was a gay woman who wasn't public at that time. She was also a publicist. And so Marty's background was as a publicist working in New York, and at Macy's and other sales positions and publicity, and she was a writer. And so as she entered her recovery, she started to convince Bill Wilson, who was her sponsor at the time, to tell the story of Alcoholics Anonymous. And part of what she did was help them tell their story of the big book through different articles and different things. But she really started to grow infatuated with a woman named Dorothea Dix, who was a mental health advocate in the 1800s and stood up and really changed some things for the mental health movement. And so she said she wanted to do that for alcoholism. So she started something called the National Committee of Education on Alcoholism. And that became the National Council on Alcoholism, which became the National Council on Alcoholism and Drug Dependence. And that was really the forebearer of the recovery advocacy movement. And that organization brought together local people across the country. Marty would fly around the country telling her story at Lions clubs and different kinds of community gatherings. And she would stand up and talk about alcoholism and more from a disease perspective. And there's lots of amazing recordings of her and the things she was saying in the 1940s. Some of us say today still, maybe in some different language, but very similar messages in terms of what she was saying. And she, essentially went on, what you could call a crusade to help people understand alcoholism, and not from a perspective of this is on the heels of the temperance movement. This is happening during World War II. All of these things are happening in the world, and Marty's doing this work. And she was so successful at the work she did by about 1955, Edward R. Murrow, who's a famous, very famous broadcaster, was doing a list of the 10 greatest living Americans. And this was Helen Keller, this was Eleanor Roosevelt, and Marty Mann was on that list. And he did a profile of her in 1955. And so she's a force of nature. When you hear her recordings, when you hear her talk, she's just an incredible storyteller. And she just became, the person who many credit when the American Medical Association, declared alcoholism a disease, I think in 1954, and some other huge milestones. But fast forward to kind of the pinnacle of her advocacy and her work, while it was Marty and some other folks doing this work, it was still very localized and local communities doing the work. And she ultimately, in the Anonymous People, if you've seen it, she got the hearings with Senator Hughes going in 1969, which got into the Hughes Act. And they got some people to come to that hearing. They got Mercedes McCambridge, but Harold Hughes has told some incredible stories about, trying to get public figures in recovery to stand up and reduce the stigma. And it kind of all came together in 1976, 50 years ago, this year. And so we're really excited to be talking about what happened 50 years ago. Two major events, as well as some other recovery advocacy things happened. And so what Marty was able to do in 1976 was hold a press conference. And it was really her, along with Harold Hughes and others, who got people into this room in DC. And at this point, like, nobody was talking about it publicly. It was still like, there was a big battle around anonymity and staying quiet, but Marty kept pushing through. And it was she became kind of this linchpin. And in Sally and David Brown's the book about Marty, what they put together is they brought 50 prominent people together to kind of stand up for recovery in this hotel ballroom. And the press turnout was massive. Each celebrity was identified in alphabetical order. All was quiet, but when the MC, Dr. Luther Cloud, announced, "This is Marty Mann," all the celebrities rose to their feet and applauded and cheered Marty. She sat there in a state of shock. She couldn't believe the ovation was for her. Marty was a celebrity's celebrity in that room. And the list of names, I mean, we still have two that are living today. One gentleman walked on the moon, Buzz Aldrin, and another just turned 100 years old, Mr. Dick Van Dyke. And in this photo, there's some really powerful people from all walks of life. So Marty's work at NCADD and the National Council was largely funded through Brinkley Smithers and the Smithers Foundation. And so Brinkley Smithers was in this room, one of the largest philanthropy family foundations to ever give to this movement. If in today's money, certainly, there was a large business folks like Thomas Pike. Wilbur Mills was a United States congressman, with some recent press about him too. It's fun. Gary Moore was the star of To Tell the Truth. So there was this very famous television show in the 70s, and it was hosted by Gary Moore. He was an icon at that time. So think, John Mulaney or Jon Stewart, and Gary Moore was that in the 70s. Mercedes McCambridge won an Oscar, and she perhaps some of the work that she did in some of the treatment facilities still today in Pennsylvania, and others kind of have some heritage of Mercedes McCambridge. Dick Van Dyke, as I mentioned, there's still a treatment center in New York named after Dick Van Dyke. Clancy I, or Ismond, was in this room. Many through the 12-step movement know Clancy and his speaker tapes. Most people don't know that he sat very publicly in a press conference telling his story about recovery in 1976. So that surprises a lot of people in the recovery advocacy movement. Senator Harold Hughes, as I mentioned, Jan Clayton. There was surgeons, military folks, Don Newcombe, baseball star, Don Newcombe, and there was another baseball star. I can't remember his name right now, but anyways, so there was this group of 50 people, and their presence made news around the country. And so this was a moment that changed it. While they kind of stood up and talked about themselves, it really became a we moment in the press and in the culture, where it wasn't just Marty's story or Dick Van Dyke's story or Buzz's story, but it was all of them coming together with this collective we story that made front page news all across the country. And I can't tell you, when I was going around screening the anonymous people, and still to this day, this is anecdotal, but but hundreds and hundreds of people I met got sober and entered recovery in 1976. And I just can't shake the feeling that those two things aren't correlated in some way. I know Sir Anthony Hopkins is celebrating 50 years very publicly this year of recovery. And so those kinds of things that all have some lineage or tie back to 1976 and some of the work that was done. And so here's a picture of Dick Van Dyke. This is Buzz Aldrin, Don Newcomb. This is Wilbur Mills. This is Harold Hughes. So if you ever get a chance, he's one of the most incredible orators you've ever heard. Him and Marty, the two of them, working in tandem, they could own a room, and he's got an amazing biography and an amazing story about some of the work that he did in the 1970s. I was just talking to a friend about, with a little help of our friends. So Nancy Olson wrote a book about working with Senator Hughes and how they got all those bills passed in the 1970s, kind of culminating in this moment. And this is Mercedes McCambridge. So she was one of the first. She came to the hearings in 1969, as folks might see in the Anonymous People, and she didn't do so much acting afterwards. And so a lot of people will say that perhaps her stepping out and standing up, certainly as a woman in recovery in Hollywood, may have hurt her career. But she did it nonetheless, right? And Senator Hughes talks about her courage and charisma. She's got one of the most incredible. I didn't do video in this because it doesn't work over Zoom well. But maybe we can send it out after. We'll post a link. But she's got one of these amazing, quotes in this about Abraham Lincoln and her reason for being there. And then this is Gary Moore. And so Operation Understanding is exactly what it was, challenging the stigma. They came together, they made press, they made news, and it really led to, I think, a lot more increased work and increased advocacy as well from a policy standpoint, from a news standpoint. It was in May of '76, and we'll be talking about this throughout the year. But 1 month later, it was an even different kind of event that occurred that maybe even is less famous and has gotten less attention than this first event did. But the groups overlap quite a bit. And what happened about a month later is maybe even more astonishing and spectacular. So I'll kick it over to Jeremiah to tell the story about what happened in June of '76.
Well, thank you, Greg. Thank you, Aaron. I'm really excited to be with you all. I mean, I have this niche fascination with 1976 recovery advocacy like Greg does. And let me tell you, when that's an interest of you, it's a bummer because nobody ever asks about it until this year. And so I lit up when Ryan and Greg and Garrett and Aaron reached out about this, and I'm very happy to talk about it. Again, I'm Jeremiah Gardner. I'm with the Hazelden Betty Ford Graduate School, which is a part of the nonprofit Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. I'm a person in long-term recovery, and I will say just on a personal note that nothing's been probably more influential to my personal and professional journey than slowly expanding my knowledge of the community and the heritage that I'm a part of, from the people I was in treatment with 20 years ago in 2006 to people in 12-step rooms, to learning from Greg and his movie, and from a lot of people who were on the call, and from William White, and discovering that not only was I not alone, but I was part of a rich cultural heritage and history. And so that's partly why I'm so excited to learn as we about our history. As Greg mentioned, Marty Mann was amazing. Her biography, I'm just showing it right here. I'm proud that it was published by Hazelden Publishing. And I want to highlight, if you can go to the next slide, Greg, are you or Aaron, whoever's in control, one thing from that book, and that is Marty's description of recovery as freedom. Freedom from being trapped, from feeling helpless, from having to prove oneself, freedom from anger and fear, and not just freedom from things, but freedom toward things, freedom to know happiness and love. I know that sure resonates with me, and I'm sure it resonates with many of you, and it's that theme of recovery as freedom that would come to life at the event Greg was just alluding to a month after Operation Understanding. Greg, you can... For a handful of the participants in that momentous Operation Understanding event in Washington, D.C., it was really just the beginning of a blitz of recovery advocacy that took place that year and into the next. In fact, these 5 people took a moment at the D.C. event to get a photo of themselves because they had all committed to be at this another event a month later in Minnesota with the goal of continuing to amplify a growing national conversation around recovery. And you see here, it's Don Newcomb again, Senator Harold Hughes, Dick Van Dyke, Gary Moore, and Buzz Aldrin. And I love seeing that people are validating your hunch, Greg, that 76 was a big year for people to start their recovery journey. I've encountered that as well, and there's people on the call that are among that group. Let's go to the next one. The event we're alluding to it was called Freedom Fest 76. This is kind of an iconic photo from that event. It took place on June 26, 1976 at Metropolitan Stadium. Now today, that's where the Mall of America exists in the Twin Cities here. At that time, it was where the Minnesota Vikings and the Twins played. And about 30,000 people attended, making it the largest recovery advocacy event in our history, a distinction it still holds today. Marty Mann wasn't there herself, but her messaging and her organizing really played an inspirational role. Obviously, this year was really the culmination of all her work over many years. And again, echoing her own words, this was a celebration of freedom from addiction. And it was held in the same year that America was celebrating its 200th anniversary of its founding on principles of freedom. In fact, this event was dubbed Minnesota's gift to the bicentennial. And one way I think about these two events together is that if Operation Understanding made headlines with its star power, Freedom Fest brought those headlines to the people. There were still celebrities and prominent public officials there. You see the exuberant Dick Van Dyke, who Greg mentioned, just turned 100. He's still dancing today. But Freedom Fest also brought together everyday people in recovery, as well as families and allies, in a public celebration at a time when even acknowledging recovery was still very rare. And it was a public way of demonstrating that people do recover, and they don't just recover, but in large numbers. I mean, look at that crowd. And it was covered by the press prominently, as was Operation Understanding. Probably not nationally as much as the one in D.C. event was covered, but very prominently in Minnesota, and I have found many newspaper stories from various places around the country. And what people who read about it and saw about it was that tens of thousands of people were standing proudly in recovery. And for many attendees, this was the first time they experienced recovery as a celebrated identity rather than a hidden one. And again, if you just look at that site, I still get goosebumps thinking about what it must have been like to be there. Let's go to the next one. It was a big deal. I mean, 3 of the nation's most prominent senators, Hubert Humphrey, Walter Mondale, and Harold Hughes, all spoke. Hughes, of course, was in recovery, just an enormous figure in our history of recovery advocacy. Humphrey and Mondale, who both also served as U.S. vice presidents, were there as allies and supporters of Minnesota's leadership in addiction treatment and recovery community. Minnesota's governor was there as well, and President Gerald Ford was actually scheduled to be there and had to cancel at the very last minute due to an emergency economic summit with 6 other world leaders. I'm fascinated by that because I imagine his wife, First Lady Betty Ford, the namesake of my own organization, would have attended with him. She was still 18 months away from getting treatment herself for opioid and alcohol use disorder. And I often wonder whether Operation Understanding, which took place in her home city of D.C. at that time, and Freedom Fest, which she was probably scheduled to attend with her husband, influenced her at all from a distance. And I think the remarkable fact that Betty Ford held her own press conference upon arriving at treatment just a year and a half later. I mean, who would think to do that if not for an example, kind of like Greg described in D.C. at Operation Understanding and with Freedom Fest? We'll never know for sure, but she certainly followed the clarion call, I think, that these two events sent out to people in recovery. Now, remember, this was a period also of cultural upheaval, kind of like we're experiencing in some ways today. A different era, obviously, but experimentation, drug culture was very prominent. Public understanding of addiction or the disease was growing, but still limited. And this was a powerful counter narrative display of hope, healing, and community strength. In addition to the politicians that we looked at, it also featured widely known figures from the entertainment world. You see Don Newcomb again. Marilyn Sellers was a country and gospel singer whose most famous hit was One Day at a Time, very apt. Fran Tarkenton was an all-pro quarterback at the time, current all-pro quarterback for the Minnesota Vikings at that time. He wasn't in recovery. He was an ally. Art Linkletter was a famous TV and radio host who'd experienced addiction in his family. And again, they represent, I think, an expansion from Operation Understanding to really bring into the tent families and allies. And I think that's a big part of the Freedom Fest legacy. Let's go to the next one. Here's some more notable speakers and performers. I kind of think it was cool that Swami Rama, an Indian yoga and meditation guru, was there. He's in the bottom right corner. And also family therapy pioneer Virginia Satir. Again, expanding the tent of advocates to include not just people in recovery, but also family members, allies, and in the case of Virginia and Swami Rama, helping professionals. I think that was important because successful movements typically find ways to expand the tent rather than narrow it. Let's go to the next one. Freedom Fest helped lay the... It was a cultural event in a lot of ways, and a culture builder. As you'll see in a minute, there were branded t-shirts, hats, bumper stickers, buttons, original music. The event program even featured this original cartoon by Dennis the Menace creator Hank Ketchum, who had experienced addiction in his family. And, you know, William White, a historian and advocate that we all have been influenced by, whether we realize it or not, most of us do realize it. He talked often about the potential benefits of building and expanding cultural identity around recovery in a way that allows it to intersect with the broader culture. And I think Freedom Fest took a big step in that direction. Let's go. Thank you. Freedom Fest was the brainchild of Wheelock Whitney and his first wife, Irene. Wheelock was a businessman in Minnesota, a philanthropist, and a tireless recovery advocate inspired by his wife Irene's own recovery. And their son Ben says his mom was really the heart of the event and the dad was the head. They made a good team, he said. But they had seen and experienced firsthand and early on that stigma was one of the biggest barriers to treatment and long-term recovery, and that's what they sought to address with this event. And let's just say it sure helped that Wheelock was a person of means with lots of prominent friends. Most of the celebrities appeared at no cost. The facilities and grounds were donated for the most part. The total cost of Freedom Fest was a whopping $138,000, and they sold almost 30,000 tickets for $3.50 a piece. So it was a very modest loss financially, but certainly worth it in spades to all of us. Cameras were everywhere. Interviews were taking place. As you see here, while everyone in the stands awaited the main event. I should point out, this is the stadium. There was a main event in the evening, early evening, but before that, all afternoon long, there was a state fair like atmosphere in the parking lot and in the neighboring Met Center where the Minnesota North Stars hockey team played. And I don't think there's been an event quite like it since, but obviously today's recovery walks, rallies, festivals, and advocacy is influenced by it, especially, and I just want to take a moment to shout out Greg, especially the Unite to Face Addiction rally on the National Mall in 2015, which is, a direct, I think, descendant of the idea that Freedom Fest represents. And I think for those of us who, you should shout out in the chat if you were there. I was there in 2015, and I think most of the people on this call were, and I will just say that it was a seminal event that I will never forget, and that really made a difference in my life, as this event did to the people that were there at the time. Let's go to the next one. Again, if Operation Understanding sent the message that addiction can affect anyone, even the most talented and successful people in society, Freedom Fest was more grassroots oriented, everyday people. The message was that addiction is common, that it affects a lot of people, and so too is recovery. And it's also attractive. Look at us smiling, having fun, carrying no shame. I've been able to talk to several people who were at Freedom Fest 50 years ago. I also tracked down a long-lost documentary made about the event called One Day, which I hope you'll get to see some footage from that, perhaps, and some of the footage from Operation Understanding that Greg has at the Mobilize Recovery event in December, if you're one of the lucky ones that goes to that. But every single attendee I've come across has described Freedom Fest as transformative. Just like I think Unite to Face Addiction in 2015 was transformative for us. Dr. Marvin Sepula is one who was there. He was 20 and new in recovery at the time. He went on to become the chief medical officer at Hazelden Betty Ford, and said that it was seeing thousands openly celebrate recovery made sobriety feel normal to him right away early in his recovery, and not a deficit, but a lifestyle worth celebrating and honoring. And he's one of many people that I've met who were at that event and were inspired to help others in a variety of ways over the course of their careers. I want to point out one more thing. Well, we don't need to go back to the slide, but there, to give you just one sense of the vibe, there were 40 group reunions at this event. There was tailgating, live music, bingo and other games, a variety show, a martial arts demonstration, a teen drop-in center. There were books and crafts and discussions, film showings. This was all taking place in the parking lot and at the Met Center prior to the main event in the stadium that evening. And one song featured, there he is right there in the bottom left corner. There was one song featured during the evening program that was a contest winner, and the song was called A Fest of Freedom by local musician Jerry Esno, who's still a wonderful hippie making music in the Twin Cities today. And his lyrics were in the event program, which helped nearly 30,000 people sing along as he sang, once this country was young with rebellion, struggling to gather for release, aren't we all a bit like our own country? We want peace. And I'm actually going to, for fun, put that in the chat. After we're done, you can listen to that song if you feel like it. Let's go back to that. One more. It doesn't really matter. I guess one more.
You want the end or?
No, that one right there. That right there.
Okay.
Yeah. So many attendees vividly recall, and I just kind of wanted you to imagine what it was like. The moment at the end of this big event where 30,000 people after they sang along with Jerry Esno's song, A Fest of Freedom, they joined hands in the Serenity Prayer. And, beyond the timeless wisdom in that prayer or meditation, for many, I think it represented what all of this, I think, represents to me, and that is community, unity, sort of shared understanding and humility, and a commitment to each other. And just a really powerful representation of that, which I think is hopefully what drives us today as we think about recovery advocacy in 2026. I'd be remiss in not acknowledging that people had experienced similar moments at AA conventions for years, but this was a little different. The public nature of this made it qualitatively different, and I think an important expansion and broadening of sorts. Yeah, let's go to that next one then. And I would share a few things on this slide, and then we'll get to some questions and discussion. But these two events were really a powerful 1-2 punch against stigma. Operation Understanding, again, was a national, media-driven, kind of top-down. Freedom Fest was more grassroots, people-powered, and bottom-up. And I want to highlight, among the press coverage, two of Minnesota's most popular columnists wrote about Freedom Fest. And one of them was Don Morrison, who used the occasion to proclaim his own recovery for the first time in a public way. And another was Jim Klobuchar, who perhaps stowed away some inspiration for getting sober a couple of decades later, which he did. Jim's daughter is U.S. Senator Amy Klobuchar, and inspired by her dad's journey, she became and remains a huge champion for addiction treatment and recovery solutions today. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. The more you dig into this event, and I think the more you dig into recovery advocacy and the impact we're able to make in small communities, the larger community, the more you can see the ripples of impact that continue today. Sometimes they happen quickly, sometimes they happen over time, but we make a difference. And when you explore an event like this, you start to see the difference. And that's another, I think, big reason to look back at our history, is so that you can see sometimes it doesn't always, we don't feel the fruit being born from our efforts, but our history tells us that we should trust that our efforts are always making a difference. And I think as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of this seminal year, our goal isn't just to revisit, but to activate each other and the current and next generation of advocates. So I'm super grateful to Mobilize Recovery and all of you for leading the way. The movement that started in 1976 is still unfolding. Many of you have been intimately involved. As we know, there are obstacles and opportunities all the time. As Bill Stauffer, who I think is on the call, and William White have pointed out, we have sort of a cyclical history of gains, setbacks, and resurgences. And, I'd say it's always our turn to keep it going. So, and progress doesn't require perfect conditions, just committed people.